Let me tell you a little story. So, about 6 years ago, I began to take an interest in Jewish history, which ultimately turned into this channel. And I asked a very basic question, which was I know that I'm Jewish, I know that I live in America, guess that makes me a Jewish American, but who was the first Jewish American? That fateful day in 2019, I learned about the story of the 23 Jews who came to what is today New York all the way back in 1654. I learned how the governor of the colony didn't want to let them stay and gave the Jews a hard time. And then I learned about one man, the first Jewish American, by the name of Usher Levy. From that point on, I became obsessed with learning more about his story. And I'm really excited to talk to someone who knows a lot about this story and has been researching it for a very long time, named Daniela Weil. She is the author of The Diary of Usher Levy, or Asser Levy. So let's go through this story together about the first Jewish American that took place right here in New York.
Growing up in Brazil, you hear a lot of this story about how the Brazilians founded New York. And I'm like, what is that about? I had heard that there were Jews in Brazil, in Recife, which is in the northern part, that had fled Recife when the Portuguese took over the Dutch colony, and they ended up in New York. That was kind of the story that we hear in Brazil. So when I arrived in the United States and became a writer, I said, let me look back at that story and see what it's really about. That's when I discovered Asser Levy. There were 23 Jews that arrived from Brazil, but eventually they all sort of left or disappeared. But Asser Levy stayed, and he became an important historical figure in New York, and the book became sort of centered around his story.
So let's explore the remarkable story of the refugees who left Brazil, came to a distant colony, and started a new Jewish community called She'ereth Israel, making them the first Jewish community in the future United States. We'll see how the story of one man who refused to give up in the face of oppression left a legacy that affects all of us today. If you're new to this channel, my name is David, and here on Yiddishkeit, we explore the experience of Jewishness. Personally, I like to do that by analyzing Jewish history, culture, and art. This story about Usher Levy, sometimes pronounced Asser Levy, feels not only like such an important piece of Jewish history, but this story has captured my imagination for the past several years now. And so I'm really excited to share that story with you right now. To truly understand the story of Usher Levy and the first Jews in America, we need to rewind the clock all the way back to 1492, when the Spanish kingdom expelled its Jews. For over a century, the Jews of Spain underwent oppression and massacres, causing many to convert to Christianity, only to be persecuted more viciously. But now, in 1492, the remaining Jews of Spain needed to leave their homes, and 5 years later, Portugal would expel their Jews as well. Though the Jews of Spain, known as the Sephardim, had lived there for hundreds of years, starting in the 1500s, this community lived everywhere but in Spain and Portugal. As the diaspora spread to many countries, a community formed in the Netherlands, in the city of Amsterdam. Its most famous products are perhaps the controversial philosopher Baruch Spinoza and the illustrated Amsterdam Haggadah. During the 1600s, the Dutch were having their golden age, where their culture flourished in many areas of science, philosophy, and art. This was the age of the microscope, Descartes, and Rembrandt. And all of this was paid for by the country's policy known as mercantilism, which means that the main way the country made money was by buying and selling goods. And so during the Age of Exploration, they would start the Dutch West India Company to establish profitable colonies to dominate against their main rival, the English. And so to stay ahead, the Dutch chose a pragmatic approach of tolerance for the sake of earning a profit.
Part of the reason why I love this story so much, I have to give it to the Dutch. The Dutch are awesome. Not that they're all clean and squeaky, because, they were involved in the slave trade, but they came up with this concept of tolerance, which was just not a thing back then. And the Dutch were like, no, come on in, you have business to do. You want to have a synagogue? That's fine. Just kind of keep to yourself. Don't make trouble. We're okay with it.
The Dutch had sent the explorer Henry Hudson, who claimed the area of New York today, and eventually in the 1620s, the Dutch established a colony called New Netherland, with the settlement on Manhattan being called New Amsterdam. However, the first Jewish community in America that would develop here in New Amsterdam would not come from the city that it was named after, but rather from Brazil. The city of Recife in the north of Brazil came under Dutch control in 1630. And in the years following, hundreds of Jews came from Amsterdam to Recife to take part in the growth and trade of sugarcane for the Dutch Empire. By 1654, there was a thriving Jewish community in Recife with over 1,000 community members. And this thriving community that was about to be scattered is what first caught Daniela's attention.
I thought was important to include a little bit of the story of Brazil. When you tell people, did you know that the first Jews in New York came from Brazil? They're like, what? Since I'm writing the story anyways, let's educate people at the beginning of this story, which really is from Brazil, which is where I come from. And it's such an interesting story. The synagogue in Brazil was the first synagogue in the New World.
The synagogue is called Kahal Tzur Yisrael and was built by the community in 1636 and has stood there ever since. In 1641, Rabbi Isaac Aboabdi Fonseca from Amsterdam came to lead the congregation. Now, he was a big Torah scholar, he was the teacher of Baruch Spinoza, and later, when he would return to Amsterdam, he would be part of excommunicating the young philosopher.
I did go to the synagogue in Brazil. It's got two levels, and on the bottom level, the remnants of the synagogue, if you will, and you can see some of the old stones. It's turned into a museum, and you can see the mikvah, it's really cool, And the buildings there are all the original colonial buildings, so you can actually see how the street was, where these people were living. It's still very much like it was back then. The top part of the synagogue was rebuilt to be a current synagogue, so you can actually go there and it's an operating synagogue.
The book opens at the end of this 25-year period, in January of 1654. This is when the Portuguese attack the Dutch and take over the city of Recife.
But when the Portuguese took it back, the territory was Catholic again. And with Catholicism comes Inquisition, and it was not a safe place for the Jews to be anymore. It was safe when it was the Dutch colony because the Dutch believed in religious freedom. The Portuguese were nice enough, let's say, to allow some time for the Jews to leave that colony and to go back. And most of them went back to Amsterdam.
The book is in the form of a diary, which covers the period from 1654 to 1656, and tells a story in two parts. The first part is about leaving Brazil and ending up in another Dutch colony called New Amsterdam, although you may know it by its later name, New York. The second part is about how Usher Levy had to fight with the authorities to become a citizen of the colony and to achieve certain rights, which set the foundation for us to have those same rights today. So let's dive into the first part of the story, where the Jewish community of Recife, including Usher Levy, are boarding a ship called the Falcon.
What their intention was when they left Brazil, we don't know for sure. We can assume that they were probably trying to get back to Amsterdam.
However, this is not what ended up happening.
At some point in the Caribbean, there was a storm. It was taken off its path. And in the midst of this being taken off its path, it was also attacked by pirates. And it ended up being shipwrecked in Jamaica. Jamaica was also a hostile country for Jews. So this document that we have is a letter that was written by the government in Holland to the King of Spain. And this letter describes that there was a ship that was shipwrecked called the Valk, and some of the passengers were taken prisoner in Jamaica, and so they're requesting their release. This letter describes like what they went through, the hardships that they went through because of the storm, because of the pirates, because of their poverty, their financial situation that they were in, and they're begging for these Jews to be released. So this is the document that joins the Brazil part of the story to the New Amsterdam part of the story.
As the Jewish captives are released from Jamaica, they end up in Cuba to try to find passage to Dutch territory. They end up striking a deal with the captain of a ship called the St. Catherine named Jacques de la Motte. The Jewish refugees seem to have been under the wrong impression that there was already a Jewish community in New Amsterdam who would help them pay for the journey to safety. But what they didn't realize is that they would be the ones who would have to establish it. I really love this moment in the book where she describes this moment where they're going from Jamaica to Cuba, setting the stage for New Amsterdam. June 20th, 1654. I never thought I would look forward to boarding the Falcon again, but the prospect of leaving Jamaica and getting back home was comforting. I resettled in my hammock next to the Israels and was happy to see that most of the passengers were back to their spots. I counted 23 of us. To me, the moment of arrival of the 23 Jewish refugees into New Amsterdam is the most magical of moments. As a child of immigrants, I happen to romanticize this moment a lot. You probably recognize this motif, the moment from the 1890s where immigrants are seeing New York Harbor for the first time off their ship with the Statue of Liberty in the background. But here is a group of Jews who are having that very same experience for the very first time over 200 years before the generation of the Great Wave. That fact has always captured my imagination ever since I learned the story. As the 23 refugees step off the St. Catherine into New Amsterdam for the very first time, they quickly learn that there is no Jewish community in New Amsterdam and that they were now stuck with paying this fee for the journey to the captain of the ship. And so there begins this court case where the captain sues the 23 Jewish refugees, and eventually what happens is that their belongings, the very few things they have left, are auctioned off to pay the captain, but there's still this remaining balance that they owe him. And so being all alone in the new world, having basically no possessions, and having this debt that they owe the captain, the Jewish community had very few options. And very soon, some of the local population began to voice opposition to their presence. Keeping these penniless Jewish refugees in the colony would become an economic strain on the local wholesalers and merchants. And so very soon, the governor of the colony, a man named Peter Stuyvesant, would get on the case to try to make them leave.
Governor Stuyvesant, he's a complex guy. So in one side was a very sort of authoritarian, larger than life figure who, was trying to manage this colony that had people from all over the world that spoke different languages and had different religions. And this was very unusual for back, in the 1600s. Preconceived, prejudices against Jews. That was quite normal. And he belonged to that group of people, so he didn't hide it. He didn't want Jews in his colony. And there are documents that name Jews all sorts of things, when they're trying to make their case to Holland to get these people deported. It's a very colorful language to describe the Jews. At the same time, like I was saying, he was kind of in a pickle, Governor Stuyvesant, where, he had very little money that he was being given from the Netherlands. He had almost no weapons. There was the threat of the English. And so when 23 people come into your territory and you have to feed them and clothe them and find a house for them, and you don't even like them in the first place, he's like, nah, I'm not dealing with this.
So to get help, the refugees write this letter to their fellow Jews back in Amsterdam. They tell their story of what happened with Recife and Jamaica and Cuba and being shipwrecked and now being penniless in New Amsterdam. And so they pass this message along, and it reaches the Dutch West India Company in January of 1655. In the book, you can actually see a picture of this letter, and you actually can read it for yourself in English. The Jews of Portuguese origin residing in New Amsterdam respectfully challenge your consideration to deny us the right to remain in New Netherland. That decision would not only be a disadvantage to the Jews, but it will be very damaging to the company. The letter describes the story of how the Jews lived in Recife, how they helped the company flourish there, and how they had to leave quickly with very little possessions when the Portuguese took it over. The letter also makes reference to the fact that there were many Jewish shareholders in the Dutch West India Company that came from that Jewish community in Amsterdam. Here's how the letter ends. Please consider allowing us all the liberty to contribute to this town like all other citizens. In the spring of 1655, the company's response would finally reach the colony, and it would allow the poor Jews to stay and open up the colony to other Jews of means who would help drive the colony's economy, further the company's interest, and coincidentally, help the poor Jews. Thus, their debt to Captain Lamott was paid, and the Jews were given the ability to live and work in New Amsterdam. Unlike other colonies that would later comprise the United States, like Massachusetts, that were started as a Christian project to bring about messianic times, the Dutch, although devout Christians, did not start their colony in America to spread Christianity, but to make money. And as a result, New Amsterdam became a place of tolerance. This moment of the arrival of Jews in 1655 is also a really legendary moment, as this is when the first Torah scroll was brought to North America, to what is now the United States. This painting was commissioned by the American Jewish Tercentenary Committee, which was organized to celebrate 300 years after the arrival of the 23 refugees in New Amsterdam. In the book, you can also see the document from the Amsterdam City Archives, which describes the scene of the new Jewish families arriving with a Torah scroll. Despite the initial victory in being allowed to remain and start the first Jewish community in North America, the governor, Peter Stuyvesant, tried to make the Jews leave by enforcing many of the rules on the books. For example, as the Dutch colony began declining and the British takeover loomed, Stuyvesant commissioned the construction and patrol of a wall around the northern border of New Amsterdam. And this wall is now the famous Wall Street, which if you walk down it today, you can still see the posts in the ground where the wall once stood. Now, if you wanted to patrol the wall, as all citizens of the colony were ought to do, you needed to be part of the militia. The problem is that Jews were not allowed to be part of this militia, and in fact, to add insult to injury, Stuyvesant added a penalty, a fee, for those that didn't participate. For the richer families that arrived in 1655, this was an annoyance, but not a big deal. It was just another fee they had to pay. But for people like Usher Levy, who did not have a lot of money, they had no choice but to appeal this decision and to petition Stuyvesant in late 1655. To be part of the militia, or to trade, or open a business, or own land, or anything like that, you had to have the status of a citizen, which in those times was called a burgher, with an H. Now, you probably heard a similar term like bourgeois, and that actually shares the same root as this word. And so to achieve this status, Usher Levy petitioned Stuyvesant and the Dutch West India Company to give the Jews burgher rights. And by the spring of 1657, Usher Levy's efforts had succeeded, and he, together with other men from the Jewish community, became enrolled as burghers of New Amsterdam. And this made Usher Levy and the others in that group the first Jewish citizens of New York and probably the first in American history. In the 1660s, the British takeover felt imminent, and some of the Jewish families moved to other colonies, while the rest went back home to Amsterdam, taking the Torah scroll back with them in 1663. However, there was one family, Usher Levy and his wife Miriam, who remained as open Jews in the city of New Amsterdam after all of the other Jews left. Usher Levy's origins are a bit of a mystery, as addressed at the end of the book. We know his roots are not from Spain and Portugal, but from the lands of Ashkenaz, from the city of Vilna in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Right before these events of the refugees and Berger rights, starting in 1648, there was a wave of massacres in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth known as the Khmelnytsky pogroms. It is possible that Usher Levy, escaping these massacres, made his way to Amsterdam and came by choice to America in 1654, right as these refugees were arriving from Brazil.
Most of the current historians actually believe that Usher Levy arrived on the Pear Tree, which is a ship that arrived in New Amsterdam just a few weeks before the St. Catherine. And the St. Catherine is the ship that had these 23 Jews from Brazil.
Other historians disagree and say that Usher Levy left the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth before these massacres and went to Brazil, and he was in fact one of the 23 refugees. And so this is the way that it's told in the book.
For real, like, we're never gonna know which ship he arrived on. There are the documents in Brazil, but we don't have like that direct evidence, like a signature of Usher Levy in the synagogue in Brazil. We don't have that direct evidence. It's just the conclusion that I drew based on these two possibilities. That's why I haven't tied to that story.
What we do know is that in 1664, when the British took over the city and renamed it New York, the only Jews that remained were Usher Levy and his wife Miriam. What we can see at the end of this 10-year period of Dutch control that Usher Levy had become well-to-do, as he bought a home in 1661, becoming the first Jewish homeowner in America.
Remember, those rights had to be fought for, and we have the evidence of the fighting for that. Like, the Dutch West India Company slowly started sending letters saying, oh, okay, the Jews can do this, the Jews can do this, after receiving letters from Stuyvesant saying, the Jews are trying to do this. They would say, okay, let them, you know.
And to go even further, under the British, he sat on a jury in 1671, again, the very first Jew to ever do so in America. And in 1678, he opened the first kosher butcher shop in America. Although there's some debate about Usher Levy's origins, and also there's the fact that there were two Jewish people in New Amsterdam before the 23 refugees named Solomon Peterson and Jacob Bar Simpson, by the 1670s, all of them seem to have moved elsewhere. It's through Usher Levy that we have our link from 1654 with the establishment of the first Jewish community in New York, all the way to us today.
There were others in the beginning who were also involved in those things, but since he stayed until the end, we see the trace from him from the very beginning to, you know, the end of his life, with every little thing that was awarded.
As we step away from the details of Usher Levy's life and look at its broader impact, we begin to see how it affects the very reality that we as Jewish Americans live in today.
After the English conquered it, the English governor, he allowed the status quo of the Dutch colony to remain. Everybody can stay, whatever it was happening can stay happening. That concept of the tolerance continued, and this is the soul of New York until today. This is why New York is what it is. From the Dutch colony to New York, from New York to the rest of America.
We can see how the arrival of the 23 refugees and their fight to achieve civil rights was setting a precedent for what would occur in America to many people, including Jews, in the years to come. New Amsterdam itself, later named New York, became one of the biggest entranceways for refugees in American history, with the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island being built on those very same waterways. So I think if you are a descendant of immigrants who came to America, then at least in part, you have Usher Levy to thank for that. But to go even further, Daniela points out that the St. Catherine did not have 23 immigrants, but 23 refugees.
The dedication of this book is to refugees, the bravest people in the world. And I meant that then, and I mean it now. People who come from, terrible situations. Jews have been persecuted and have forced to leave their homes for millennia. But there are other groups of people that this happens to also. And the things that they have to go through to reach safety, it's a lot. And we have to be a little more compassionate. These 23 Jewish passengers on the St. Catherine were refugees. All of their homes and their businesses and their money, all of that was lost in Brazil. When they arrived in New Amsterdam, there were, like you said, officially no Jews who had settled in New Amsterdam. And they were arriving in poverty with need, right? They needed housing, they needed money, they needed food, they needed help. The governor of New Amsterdam, our friend Peter Stuyvesant, was trying to get them deported. We know this word deportation, it's going on a lot right now. The story of refugees has been happening for so long. It's fascinating.
To continue the parallel between the generations of arrival to America, the story so often told about the Great Wave is that of rags to riches, which were based on some very real stories of the time. In a similar way, Usher Levy, having lived 200 years before large-scale immigration of Jews to America, was one of the first Jewish American success stories, as he was quite wealthy and involved in a lot of businesses.
Part of the story that we see here with Asser Levy is one that Jews can identify with. A person who's coming with nothing and coming in the bottom, but quickly integrates and makes their way up. Definitely, there was this passion in this man to make it. Asser Levy stayed in New Amsterdam, and he fought for his rights.
Usher Levy died in 1682 and was inherited by his wife, Miriam. Today, all that we have left of him is his legacy, as well as some documents like his estate and many lawsuits. We can actually see the fact that he was an open Jew to the end in his estate documents, where we see certain ritual objects listed, such as a Kiddush cup, a Shabbos lamp, and a besamim box. One of the cool things about this book is that Daniela includes pictures and links to many important documents that are involved in this story that you can actually look up and kind of read for yourself, as well as a list of locations of important places that have to do with the story of Usher Levy that you can actually go and visit.
This book, it's based on history. There are, conversations there that didn't happen, that's just like my way of telling the story. The main plot is written as a diary. There are like a lot of documents that I show in the book. There's a little section in the end that has like all of the locations that you can visit that happen in the story. From Recife all the way to New York.
A couple of these places that are important to mention are Congregation She'ereth Israel, which is located right off Central Park on West 70th Street. The building itself is from 1897, but the congregation traces its roots to 1654. The other locations are the 3 Jewish cemeteries in Manhattan that have the remains of the Spanish-Portuguese congregation from the time of the story. And of course, there's also a ton of material exploring Dutch Manhattan and what it was like to live during that era. If you want to experience this super important moment in Jewish history, then I recommend picking up the book, The Diary of Usher Levy, and it will take you right into it. In fact, ever since I became interested in the story of the 23 refugees and Usher Levy, I have become obsessed and really wanted to share that with you here on YouTube. The truth is that I went to a lot of these locations listed in the book, and documented it with my friend Mayor. But although I have a lot of this material, I guess you can say I got overwhelmed by the magnitude of this story. And so that's why I'm really grateful to Daniela for coming on the channel and talking to us about this story. And so that way I got to share that story with you for the first time. I hope to continue telling this story and to show you more and more details of what it was like to be Usher Levy and live through this moment. In the meantime, if you enjoy learning about Jewish history or art and culture, then you, my friend, are in the right place. My name is David, and welcome to this channel.